Rich woman accused black man of stealing. Then pilot said, "Ma'am, he owns this plane." What really happened before that unforgettable moment? How could a single sentence change everything? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We're so glad you're here for another powerful story filled with emotion, unexpected twists, and meaningful lessons. If you enjoy inspiring stories like this, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate you being part of this growing community. Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone judged too quickly based only on appearances? Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let's step into the remarkable story behind that unforgettable moment. Stop him right now. The woman's voice sliced through the quiet cabin with such certainty that conversations vanished in an instant. Every head turned toward the tall black man standing calmly beside seat 1A, his worn leather carry-on resting at his feet, his expression unreadable beneath the warm afternoon light spilling through the oval windows of the sleek private jet. For one suspended heartbeat, nobody moved. Then whispers spread from row to row like a sudden gust of wind. A flight attendant hurried forward, offering an apologetic smile while subtly positioning herself between the man and the aisle. Across the cabin, several passengers exchanged knowing glances, already convinced they understood exactly what was happening. The woman who had raised the alarm, Victoria Sterling, stood confidently in an elegant cream-colored suit, her designer handbag resting against her arm as though it were another symbol of unquestioned authority. She pointed directly at the stranger without the slightest hesitation. "He doesn't belong here," she declared. "Someone needs to check his credentials before this flight leaves." Her words carried the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. The polished walnut panels, soft cream leather seats, and crystal glasses sparkling under the cabin lights reflected a world where wealth spoke louder than introductions. The silence that followed felt heavier than the aircraft itself. The black man never argued. He never protested. Instead, Marcus Bennett calmly reached into the inside pocket of his weathered navy jacket and removed a boarding pass, offering it to the nearest flight attendant with steady hands. There was no frustration in his eyes, no attempt to defend himself before anyone had even asked a question. That unexpected composure only seemed to confuse the people watching. Victoria folded her arms. "A boarding pass doesn't prove anything," she said sharply. "I've flown on private aircraft for nearly 15 years. I know exactly who belongs in circles like this, and I've never seen him before." Several passengers nodded almost instinctively, not because they knew Marcus, but because certainty often sounded convincing. One businessman quietly closed his laptop. A young couple stopped whispering and stared toward the front of the cabin. Even the low hum of the climate system suddenly felt louder against the growing tension. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected across the runway, bathing the aircraft's silver wing in golden light while baggage crews completed their final checks. Inside, however, time seemed frozen. Marcus accepted the boarding pass back with a simple nod and looked out the window instead of toward the accusing voices surrounding him. His reflection shimmered against the glass, calm despite every suspicious glance aimed his way. The flight attendant hesitated, torn between protocol and uncertainty, while another crew member quietly reached for the intercom, unsure whether to contact the captain before the cabin door closed. No one realized that within the next few moments, one quiet sentence would overturn every assumption inside that luxurious cabin and force every passenger to confront the difference between appearance and truth. The young flight attendant, Emily Carter, accepted the boarding pass with careful hands, studying it far longer than necessary. Everything about it appeared authentic, from the flight information to the passenger identification, yet Victoria's unwavering confidence planted a seed of doubt that was difficult to ignore. Emily glanced up at Marcus Bennett. His jacket showed faint signs of wear around the cuffs, and his polished shoes carried the subtle creases of someone who valued practicality over appearance. Nothing about him matched the polished image most people associated with private aviation. Around the cabin, quiet conversations resumed, but they no longer sounded relaxed. They carried the sharp edge of curiosity. One executive whispered that charter companies occasionally made mistakes. Another suggested someone might have boarded using another passenger's reservation. Marcus heard every word, yet his expression remained remarkably calm. He simply placed his small leather bag beneath the seat and rested one hand lightly on the armrest, as though he had all the time in the world. Emily finally cleared her throat. "Sir, would you mind waiting just a little longer while I verify your information?" Marcus nodded politely. "Of course. Please take whatever time you need." His voice was steady, warm, and completely free of irritation. That answer caught Emily off guard. She had expected frustration or embarrassment. Instead, she found patience. Victoria interpreted the silence differently. She stepped forward with measured confidence, lowering her sunglasses onto the top of her head. "This is exactly why procedures exist," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Private aviation depends on trust, and trust begins with making sure the right people are on board." Several passengers exchanged uncertain looks. Her words sounded reasonable, even responsible, yet something about Marcus refused to fit the picture she was painting. He did not appear nervous. He did not avoid eye contact. He simply watched the golden sunlight shimmer across the runway outside, as though the scene unfolding around him belonged to someone else entirely. Emily walked toward the galley, quietly speaking into her headset. Within seconds, another crew member joined her, both reviewing the electronic passenger manifest on a tablet. Their brows narrowed, not because they had found a problem, but because nothing seemed out of place. Marcus Bennett was listed exactly where he should have been. Even so, uncertainty lingered. Victoria had built a reputation as an influential investor who frequently chartered luxury aircraft across the country. The crew knew her name well. Challenging her publicly could create its own complications. Emily looked back toward Marcus once more. He offered a faint smile, almost reassuring her that everything would be all right. That small gesture unsettled her more than any argument could have. Outside, the final baggage cart rolled away from the aircraft, and the cabin door remained open several minutes longer than scheduled. The delay spread through the passengers like an invisible current. Every ticking second seemed to invite another assumption, another whisper, another silent judgment. Then, without warning, the cockpit door unlocked with a quiet click. The conversation stopped almost instantly. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed across the polished aisle, and every pair of eyes turned toward the front of the cabin, sensing that whatever happened next would settle far more than a simple question about a boarding pass. Captain Daniel Brooks emerged from the cockpit with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades making decisions under pressure. His crisp navy uniform reflected the warm cabin lights as he walked down the aisle, without the slightest hint of urgency. The polished floor seemed almost silent beneath his measured steps. Every passenger watched him, expecting an apology, a security announcement, or perhaps confirmation that an unauthorized traveler had somehow slipped aboard. Victoria straightened her posture, convinced the captain was about to validate everything she had claimed. She offered a polite smile before speaking first. "Captain, thank you for coming. I believe there has been a misunderstanding with one of your passengers." Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued walking until he stood directly in front of Marcus Bennett. For a brief second, the entire cabin held its breath. Then the captain's serious expression softened into a genuine smile. He extended his hand with unmistakable respect. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett," he said warmly. "I am sorry for the unexpected delay." Marcus rose calmly from his seat and shook his hand. "No apology is necessary, Captain. Your crew was simply doing their job." The simple exchange sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Emily stared in disbelief. The businessman, near the window, slowly lowered his tablet. Even Victoria's confident expression flickered for the first time. She forced a short laugh. "Well, I suppose that clears up the boarding pass," she said, attempting to recover. "Although I still do not understand why nobody recognized him." Captain Brooks finally turned toward her. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet authority. "Ma'am, there has never been any question about Mr. Bennett's authorization to board." Victoria frowned. "Then perhaps someone should explain why he is seated here while the rest of us were left wondering who he was." The captain nodded once. "That is fair." He looked around the cabin, making brief eye contact with every passenger before speaking again. "Many of you are meeting Mr. Bennett for the first time today, so your confusion is understandable." The whispers immediately returned. One passenger leaned toward another, trying to remember whether the name sounded familiar. Another quietly searched it on a phone, only to realize there was no signal before departure. Marcus remained completely silent, allowing the captain to continue without interruption. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the nearest seat. This aircraft was scheduled for today's journey several weeks ago. Every passenger on board received a personal invitation through a private foundation. Several heads nodded. That much was true. Each guest had accepted what they believed was an exclusive networking event hosted by anonymous benefactors. No one had questioned the identity behind the invitation because the opportunity itself had seemed extraordinary. Victoria's confidence began to fade beneath growing uncertainty. She slowly lowered her handbag to the floor, watching Marcus more carefully than before. There was still nothing flashy about him. No expensive watch displayed beneath his sleeve. No designer logo demanded attention. Yet somehow the captain addressed him with a level of respect reserved only for people whose influence needed no introduction. The quiet inside the cabin deepened until even the distant sound of ground equipment outside seemed to disappear. Then Captain Brooks took one slow breath and prepared to reveal the truth that would change every assumption made during the last 15 minutes. Captain Brooks allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. His calm voice carried through the cabin with effortless authority. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Marcus Bennett is not simply one of today's invited guests. He paused just long enough for every curious face to focus entirely on him. He is the owner of this aircraft. For several seconds, no one reacted. It was as though the words needed time to find a place inside the room. Victoria blinked twice, convinced she had misunderstood. The businessman, near the window, slowly lowered his glasses. Emily instinctively looked back at the electronic passenger manifest, suddenly realizing why Marcus's reservation had appeared with unrestricted access codes. The realization spread from seat to seat like a silent wave. Marcus remained standing beside his chair with the same quiet composure he had shown from the moment he boarded. Nothing about his posture changed. He neither smiled nor searched for anyone's reaction. Captain Brooks continued. This Gulfstream was acquired through Bennett Aviation Holdings 6 months ago as part of an expansion dedicated to private humanitarian travel and educational initiatives. Another ripple of whispers moved across the cabin. Victoria stared at Marcus, then at the polished interior surrounding her, as though seeing everything for the first time. She remembered every assumption she had made only minutes earlier. She had looked at his simple jacket, his modest travel bag, and his calm silence, then filled in the rest of the story herself. None of it had been true. There must be some mistake, she finally whispered, though even she no longer sounded convinced. Captain Brooks answered gently. There is no mistake, ma'am. Marcus finally spoke, his tone carrying neither pride nor resentment. People often expect ownership to look a certain way. I learned a long time ago that appearances are usually the least interesting thing about a person. His words were quiet, but they landed more heavily than any raised voice could have. No one interrupted. Even the soft hum of the cabin ventilation seemed distant now. Victoria lowered herself slowly into her seat. For the first time since boarding, she could not find another argument. She replayed every sentence she had spoken, every confident accusation she had made, and each one echoed back with a different meaning. Emily stepped closer to Marcus, her cheeks slightly flushed. Mr. Bennett, I owe you an apology, she said sincerely. Marcus offered a reassuring smile. You were trying to protect your passengers. There is nothing wrong with taking responsibility seriously. His gracious response only deepened the quiet reflection spreading through the cabin. Several passengers who had silently agreed with Victoria now looked down at their hands rather than toward Marcus. The atmosphere had completely transformed. The tension that had filled the aircraft moments ago gave way to something much heavier than embarrassment. It was self-awareness. Captain Brooks glanced toward the open cabin door where the ground crew waited for departure clearance. Then he looked back at the passengers. Before we begin today's flight, he said, there is something every person on this aircraft deserves to know. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, giving the captain permission to continue. Whatever came next, it was clear that owning the airplane was only a small part of a much larger story, and every person in the cabin was about to discover why they had truly been invited aboard. Captain Brooks slowly looked around the cabin, making certain every passenger was listening before he continued. Several months ago, Mr. Bennett asked our company to organize a very unusual flight. He did not ask us to gather celebrities, investors, or executives. He asked us to find teachers, engineers, nonprofit leaders, entrepreneurs, military veterans, medical professionals, and young innovators who had quietly dedicated their lives to opening doors for other people. Curious expressions replaced embarrassed ones. The passengers began looking at one another differently, realizing they had all been selected for a reason they still did not understand. Marcus finally stepped forward, resting one hand gently against the back of his seat. "I appreciate all of you for accepting the invitation," he said with calm sincerity. "Most of you believed you were attending a private leadership conference. That is partly true. But before we arrive, I wanted every person on this aircraft to meet each other without knowing titles, companies, or accomplishments." The cabin became perfectly still once again. His words settled over the polished leather seats and walnut panels like the quiet glow of the afternoon sunlight pouring through the windows. Victoria remained motionless, listening more carefully now than at any point since boarding. Marcus continued, "When people know your resume before they know your character, they often decide who you are before you even speak. I wanted today to begin differently." A retired Air Force pilot sitting near the rear slowly nodded, as though the idea suddenly made complete sense. Across the aisle, a pediatric surgeon folded her hands together, reflecting on how often she herself had judged strangers in busy airports. Emily quietly stepped back toward the galley, no longer feeling like a crew member managing a delay, but someone witnessing an important lesson unfold in real time. Marcus smiled gently. "Some of you arrived wearing expensive suits. Others traveled in jeans. Some built successful companies. Others dedicated their careers to serving communities that rarely make headlines. None of that was supposed to matter before we met." Victoria lowered her eyes. She remembered exactly how quickly she had reached a conclusion the moment Marcus walked into the cabin carrying an ordinary leather bag. She had never asked his name. She had never offered a greeting. She had simply allowed an assumption to become certainty. The realization settled heavily inside her. Captain Brooks watched quietly, allowing Marcus to finish in his own time. "This aircraft is only transportation," Marcus said softly. "The real destination is something much harder to reach. It is the place where people stop measuring worth by appearances and start recognizing integrity, compassion, and quiet excellence." No one spoke. Even the passengers who had spent their careers giving speeches found themselves without words. The polished cabin suddenly felt smaller, not because of its size, but because every person inside was confronting private memories of moments when they had judged someone too quickly. Outside, the ground crew completed the final walk-around inspection. A green signal light appeared near the cockpit window, indicating the aircraft was cleared for departure. Captain Brooks acknowledged the signal with a brief nod before looking back toward Marcus. "There is one more reason you invited them here before takeoff," he said quietly. Marcus smiled, but this time there was unmistakable emotion behind his calm expression. "Yes," he answered, "because the most important announcement of today has not been made yet." Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded a single sheet of paper that had been creased from being carried for weeks. It was not a contract, a financial report, or a speech prepared by public relations advisors. It was a handwritten letter. He looked around the cabin before speaking again. 10 years ago, I was sitting in the last row of a commercial flight with a one-way ticket and less than $100 in my wallet. I was traveling toward an interview that I was almost certain I would not get. The passengers listened without moving. Marcus smiled faintly, remembering a moment that had changed everything. Before that flight landed, an elderly gentleman sitting beside me asked a simple question. He did not ask how much money I had. He did not ask where I came from. He asked what kind of person I hoped to become if someone finally believed in me. Marcus looked down at the letter in his hands. That man became my first investor. He believed in an idea before it was profitable. More importantly, he believed in me before I had any proof that I deserved it. A gentle silence settled across the cabin. The afternoon sunlight had shifted lower, casting long golden reflections across the polished wood panels and turning every window into a mirror. Victoria found herself staring at her own reflection instead of Marcus. For the first time that afternoon, she did not like what she saw. Marcus continued quietly. "He passed away 3 years ago. Before he died, he left me this letter. He unfolded the page completely. The paper had faded slightly along the edges. The final sentence says, "Success is measured by the number of strangers who leave your presence believing more in themselves than when they arrived." Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered. The cabin had become completely still. Even Captain Brooks remained silent, allowing the words to settle naturally. Marcus carefully folded the letter again. "I promised him that every major project I built would begin with people, not profits. That promise is the reason every one of you is sitting here today." Emily quietly wiped a tear from the corner of one eye before anyone noticed. Across the aisle, the retired Air Force pilot rested both hands on his knees and slowly nodded with quiet respect. Victoria felt her throat tighten. The confidence that had filled her voice earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing awareness that she had judged someone whose values were far greater than anything visible from the outside. Marcus looked toward the cabin door, where the bright afternoon light spilled across the carpeted aisle. "There is another reason I asked all of you to board before learning anything about one another," he said. "I wanted every conversation after today to begin with humility instead of assumptions." Captain Brooks glanced toward the cockpit where the departure checklist was complete. The engines would soon begin their quiet startup sequence. But nobody seemed eager to leave this moment behind. Marcus took one slow breath before revealing the final piece that had remained hidden from every invitation. "When this aircraft lands, none of you will be attending a conference. You will be helping launch the largest scholarship initiative our foundation has ever created for young people who have been underestimated their entire lives, and every seat on this airplane was chosen because I believe each of you can help them believe in themselves before the world does." No one spoke after Marcus finished. The words seemed to linger in the cabin long after they had been said, settling gently into every corner like the warm afternoon light that now stretched across the cream leather seats. Outside, the engines began their quiet startup sequence, a low, steady hum that blended almost perfectly with the silence inside. Captain Brooks returned to the cockpit to complete the final departure checklist, leaving the passengers alone with their thoughts. Victoria slowly stood from her seat. Just an hour earlier, she had walked through the private terminal with complete confidence, believing experience gave her the ability to judge people within seconds. Now every step toward Marcus felt heavier than the last. She stopped beside him, taking a slow breath before speaking. "Mr. Bennett," she said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology." Marcus turned toward her with the same calm expression he had carried since boarding. He did not interrupt. He simply listened. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment. "When I saw you walk onto this aircraft, I never asked your name. I never welcomed you. I looked at your clothes, your travel bag, and I filled in the rest of the story myself. I was wrong." The cabin remained completely silent. Several passengers who had quietly agreed with her accusations earlier now looked away, recognizing pieces of themselves in her confession. Marcus smiled gently, not with triumph, but with understanding. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "Admitting we were mistaken is one of the hardest things any of us can do." Victoria looked genuinely surprised. "You are not angry." Marcus slowly shook his head. "If I became angry every time someone underestimated me, I would spend my life carrying burdens that never belonged to me." His answer settled over the cabin with quiet power. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. The retired Air Force pilot smiled softly to himself. Even the businessman who had whispered doubts earlier quietly closed his briefcase and leaned back, reflecting on conversations he wished he could take back. Victoria hesitated before asking one final question. "How did you stay so calm when everyone believed I was right?" Marcus glanced toward the window where the runway shimmered beneath the golden sunlight. "Because I learned something from the man who believed in me years ago," he answered. "Other people's assumptions tell you who they are at that moment. Your response tells the world who you are." No one moved. The words carried more weight than any business presentation ever could. Victoria nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes, not from humiliation but from honest reflection. "I hope I remember that for the rest of my life," she whispered. Marcus reached into his jacket once more and removed a small envelope bearing the foundation's seal. He handed it to her with a warm smile. Confused, she carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten invitation naming her as one of the founding mentors for the scholarship program. She looked back at Marcus in complete disbelief. After everything I said, you still want me involved? Marcus answered without hesitation. The people we are trying to help do not need perfect mentors. They need honest ones. Sometimes the people who learn the biggest lesson become the ones most capable of teaching it to someone else. At that moment, the aircraft began rolling slowly away from the terminal, carrying not just passengers toward another destination, but hearts that had already begun traveling somewhere far more important. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the bright afternoon sky, and as the city slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of scattered clouds, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt completely different from the one that had existed only minutes earlier. The conversations that quietly began were no longer about business deals, investment portfolios, or impressive job titles. Instead, people introduced themselves with genuine curiosity, asking about each other's journeys rather than their achievements. Marcus watched quietly from his seat near the front of the cabin. He had hoped this would happen, but seeing it unfold naturally carried a different kind of satisfaction. Emily walked down the aisle serving coffee and tea, noticing smiles where tense expressions had been before. Even the passengers who had remained silent throughout the confrontation now leaned across the aisle to exchange stories about mentors who had changed their own lives. Victoria sat holding the invitation letter Marcus had given her, reading every line again as though she still could not believe her name was printed there. Finally, she stood once more and addressed the cabin. "May I say something?" she asked softly. Every conversation stopped. Marcus nodded with quiet encouragement. Victoria took a slow breath. "I spent years believing that experience allowed me to recognize successful people the moment I saw them. Today I learned that confidence without humility can become blindness." No one interrupted her. "I judged a man before I knew his name. I allowed appearance to become evidence. I forgot that respect should be the beginning of every conversation, not something earned after proving your value." The words were simple, but they carried unmistakable sincerity. The retired Air Force pilot smiled proudly. The pediatric surgeon quietly applauded first, followed by another passenger, then another, until gentle applause filled the cabin. Marcus did not join in immediately. Instead, he waited until the room became quiet again before speaking. "Thank you, Victoria. What matters is not that we never make mistakes. What matters is whether we allow those mistakes to make us wiser instead of more defensive." He looked around at every face. The students we are about to meet come from neighborhoods where many people have already decided what they can or cannot become. Some have been told they are not leadership material. Others have been underestimated because of where they grew up, how they speak, or the color of their skin. If we cannot recognize potential beyond first impressions, then we cannot ask them to believe in opportunities that we ourselves refuse to see. His words settled deeply into every heart on board. Captain Brooks stepped out of the cockpit for a brief moment after engaging the aircraft on its cruising route. Looking around the peaceful cabin, he smiled. "I have flown heads of state, professional athletes, and some of the wealthiest people in the country," he said. "I cannot remember another flight where people changed direction before the airplane even reached its destination." Quiet laughter spread through the cabin. It was warm, genuine, and completely free of tension. Marcus looked out through the window at the endless horizon glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. "Sometimes," he said softly, almost to himself, "the shortest distance we travel is measured in miles. The longest journey is the one from assumption to understanding." As the aircraft continued west through brilliant white clouds, every passenger realized they were no longer simply attending a Foundation event. They had already become part of the very lesson they had been invited to teach. Several hours later, the Gulf Stream descended through a blanket of soft white clouds, and the first rays of evening sunlight stretched across the horizon like ribbons of gold. From the cabin windows, the campus below came into view, its wide green lawns filled with hundreds of young students waiting beside teachers, volunteers, and families who had gathered from communities across the country. The aircraft touched down with quiet grace, and for a brief moment no one stood. The passengers simply looked outside, understanding that the journey had already changed them long before the wheels met the runway. When the cabin door opened, warm air drifted inside, carrying the sounds of laughter and hopeful conversation. Marcus stepped onto the stairs first, not as a businessman seeking recognition, but as a man honoring a promise made years earlier to someone who had believed in him before the world had. One by one, the passengers followed. Victoria paused halfway down the stairs and looked toward Marcus. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for forgiving me. For giving me the chance to become someone better." Marcus smiled with quiet warmth. Every person deserves the opportunity to write a better next chapter. Together they walked toward the gathering where dozens of scholarship recipients waited with bright eyes and nervous smiles. Many of the students wore simple clothes and carried folders, filled with dreams that had not yet been noticed by the world. Marcus stopped beside a young boy standing near the front of the crowd. The boy looked up and asked, "Sir, do you really think someone like me could become a pilot one day?" Marcus knelt just enough to meet his eyes. "I do not think someone like you can become a pilot," he answered gently. "I believe someone exactly like you can become anything you are willing to work for, especially if nobody else believes it yet." The boy's smile spread slowly across his face, brighter than the evening sun reflecting off the aircraft behind them. Victoria watched the moment in silence, remembering how quickly she had judged Marcus before ever learning his story. She understood now that real leadership was not measured by wealth, titles, or influence. It was measured by the number of lives lifted through kindness, humility, and unwavering belief in others. As the scholarship ceremony began, Captain Brooks stood quietly near the aircraft, watching the students greet the mentors who had arrived on that extraordinary flight. He glanced back at the Gulf Stream resting peacefully on the runway, then toward Marcus surrounded by hopeful young faces. A quiet smile crossed his own. The airplane had carried people across a few hundred miles, but compassion had carried them much farther. As twilight painted the sky with shades of amber and deep blue, a gentle breeze moved across the open field, lifting the scholarship banners and rustling the pages of the students' notebooks. Marcus looked toward the horizon for a single peaceful moment before turning back to the crowd. The future standing before him was no longer defined by assumptions or appearances, but by opportunity. And in that quiet evening light, no applause was needed. The smiles on the students' faces, the humility in Victoria's eyes, and the calm satisfaction reflected across Marcus Bennett's face were enough to prove a simple truth that would remain long after the sun had disappeared beyond the horizon. Kindness was never weakness. It had always been the greatest strength of all.